I'm joined here by Professor James Chin, who's the Professor of Asian Studies from Asian Institute of University of Tasmania. Thank you very much, Prof. James. And today, a whole lot of things are happening today with Pakatan Harapan, what's happening in the court. But I think we do need someone to actually tell us, explain to us what's happening. And we can see, Prof, with Pakatan Harapan, we're not seeing the outcome or the solution to the who's going to be the PM designate. It's still in a deadlock. Safudin Nasution, who is the Chief Secretary of Pakatan Harapan, issued a statement late today around 9:30. There's still no PM designate. Between Anwar and Mahathir, what's wrong?
Well, I think the situation is very fluid. Everything actually goes back to the actual formation of Pakatan Harapan back in 2017. At that time, I think they were seriously talking about, for example, how long Mahathir will serve, when Anwar will take over. But the way the final agreement was worded was that it allows a bit of a room for Mahathir to negotiate his departure date. So basically, the right way of looking at the situation was that when Pakatan was formed, two things were happening. They were unsure that they were going to win the last general election, so they didn't really go into very detail in terms of the agreement on who gets what. What they had was basically an agreement that Mahathir will serve the initial period before he hand powers over to Anwar. The discussion was basically that Mahathir will serve for 2 years. But because they didn't lock in a date, this allowed Mahathir to give the excuse that he needs more time to clean up the system, as he mentioned at the first anniversary of the Pakatan Harapan government. I think that's where the real tensions exploded. Anwar supporters were all before the first anniversary of Pakatan. You have noticed that they didn't really attack Mahathir directly. They were still working on the assumption that Mahathir will serve for 2 years, and that in May this year, the second year of the Pakatan Harapan government, that Mahathir will relinquish his power and overpower. So after the first year, where Mahathir made it very clear that he needs a bit more time to clean up the government, and that his preferred date will be sometime after APEC. Again, he did not lock down a date. I think that's when things sort of fell apart. So now I think the ongoing debate now is exactly the same issues that we're facing back in 2017. How do you lock in a date? You also have to remember that when it comes to political deal making, is unlike a normal agreement. It's not like you sign an SPA to buy a house. With political deals, you really cannot enforce it. Even if you have a date, it's very difficult to enforce, because that's the nature of politics. Things are very fluid. Things are moving all the time. A perfect example of that is that, even if the supporters of Anwar were to try to push through a change in May 2020, the government did not even last that long. In fact, the government fell apart in February this year. So really, when it comes to political deal, it's very difficult, especially if you try to lock in a date.
What Abdullah Sani, one of the leaders in in PKR, also mentioned, looking at the responses from Farhash, Anwar's aide, and some of the strong supporters of Anwar, they are willing to stay a position rather than letting Mahathir, because there's a great distrust between Anwar and Mahathir supporters. But we are also seeing a rather interesting move by other component parties. I've heard also from insiders from within Pakatan Harapan that the other component party leaders from Amanah, from DAP, as well as Warisan, has fallen back to agreeing to Mahathir and Anwar combination again. But there lies a question why they didn't look at other combination. Why not Shafi'i? Why not Shafi'i together Anwar, or even Mahathir and Shafi'i Abdal?
I think to answer that, the short answer is, I'll give you two answers. The short answer is that if you speak to the strategists, I think the underlying assumption is that Mahathir is the only one who can get a significant portion of the Malay voters in the rural areas. Anwar can get a significant portion of the voters in the urban areas. So this is the best combo. In other words, Mahathir will go after the rural Malay vote, and Anwar will go after the urban votes. And if you combine them together, you will have a majority in Malaysia, and that's basically what happened in the 2018 general elections. The longer answer is that yes, I think they did go through all the different scenarios. One of the things that was spoken about in the last few days is that you can have East Malaysia coming either as the DPM, in this case Shafi'i, or you can even offer the position to East Malaysia in the long run. The other thing they were looking at was that Mahathir would not go and chase the prime ministership again, but in fact create a jalang for his son. So that is the other option that was being looked at. So I think the long answer is that they look at all the different scenarios, but the problem is, as you mentioned earlier, the big divide is really the issue of trust. And when it comes to political deals, the key component is the trust. Any deals that are done, whether you can enforce the deal when the time is up, when you can actually have to implement the deal. So I think given the fact that we have a long history of distrust between not only Mahathir Anwar, but also among their own supporters, I think it'll be very difficult. The other point I think a lot of people has misread into the situation is that this is a quite an unusual time in Malaysia in the fact that we have a COVID crisis, and this allows the PN government to do lots of things that they normally would not do in a normal situation because Parliament will be sitting. So that's one factor. The other factor I think people keep forgetting is that even if Pakatan Harapan were to come back in the government, they will face the same instability that PN is facing now because the numbers on both sides are very, very close. In other words, both sides, even if they get in the government, will have a very slim majority. And every time you have a slim majority, it means you do not have a very, very stable government. So given the COVID crisis and the fact that both sides are sort of very equal in terms of numbers, I think things are looking shaky, not only for the Pakatan side, but also for the Perikatan side as well.
So we also see where we are looking at Perikatan Nasional. It's very shaky. Same goes with Pakatan Harapan. Both are very shaky. So we're looking at some possibilities. If in the case that the deadlock is, there's no solution, at the end of the day, Anwar and PKR stayed on, they disagree with Mahathir coming back as Prime Minister. So what will be the possible outcome of this deadlock? What will happen to PH?
So my take is that this deadlock will eventually be resolved over the next few days. I think there is a very clear understanding among the Pakatan leadership that they need to get act together. The reason why the government imploded, this is a very important point. A lot of people said that it was an internal coup. It wasn't. Things fell apart internally. So UMNO and PAS would not have been able to form this new government if things had been going well inside Pakatan. So the point I'm trying to make is that they know that they need to create a new model for Pakatan Harapan going forward, and if they want to capture government again, they cannot go back to the old Pakatan Harapan. Whatever it is, it will have to be a new Pakatan Harapan, and they need to get act fairly soon. They need to solve this issue of leadership fairly soon, because you have the July sitting of Parliament coming up. But more importantly, people keep forgetting that general elections, the next one, is merely 2 years away. So you really need time to settle down and plan for it. Some people are talking about a snap general election. I hold the view that a snap general election is very unlikely now, because even on the UMNO side, despite what they say in public, I can tell you in private, there's also a level of uncertainty. The problem with going to a general election is that you do not really know what will happen, because anything can happen during the campaign period. You may have a lead during the early part of the campaign, but if something happens 1 or 2 days before voting, things can change. And we saw this very clearly in the 2018 general elections. For example, Norman, at that time you were covering for Malaysia Kini, you can see that there was a massive swing towards Pakatan Harapan in the last 48 hours. So going for elections is always a dangerous thing for both sides because of the level of uncertainty. So my take is that it's very unlikely that they want a general elections. They will try to hold on the government as long as possible for the Perikatan side, and for Pakatan side, I think they will try to get back the government through parliament rather than through a general election.
This this view is also pretty much quite similar with what Dr. Wong Chin Huat mentioned on BFM this morning. That in the case if there is a snap election, it will be very difficult for Perikatan Nasional to win the general election or even to form the government through a general election. So looking at how the current political dynamics at the from the federal level, and we know that Sarawak state election is just if I'm not wrong, I remember from the beginning of the year, we were expecting the Sarawak state election might be held this year. Another school of thought was saying it might be, they might take the sweet time, wait till until the expiry of the Sarawak Dun. So, in your view, what do you think and how the dynamics at the federal level and how both sides are going to act or are going to take the next step in the upcoming Sarawak state election? Because the Sarawak state election will be next year, and that will be merely a year plus before the expiry of the federal parliament.
So when it comes to the Sarawak state election, I think it's very important that your viewers understand that the dynamics in Sarawak is very different. So in some ways, because Sarawak separates its federal election from the state election, most of the issue that will be fought in this coming Sarawak state election will be local or parochial issues. The federal factor will not be a major factor. For example, PAS can make a lot of noise, but if you look at the past electoral record of PAS as a party, majority of the candidates have always lost a deposit. So in West Malaysia, PAS is a major factor, but in Sarawak, it's really not a factor. So that's an example of how federal issues are really not an issue for Sarawak state election. My take was that the Sarawak state election was supposed to be held this year, but because of the fall of the PH government in February, everything has been put on hold. So I suspect they will still go for the state election later this year for a very simple reason that the Pakatan Harapan in Sarawak is sort of in a complete mess, for lack of a better word. So GPS has all the advantages now. So it is in their advantage to hold a very quick state election, and it's very likely that they will do very well among the non-Muslim Bumiputera, among the Malay Malana voters. The only question mark is what is the potential swing among the Chinese voters. Other than that, I think they're in a very good position. So I suspect GPS will probably go for a quick election sometime later this year, assuming that the PN government in KL will be stabilized after July.
Because I remember when both of us we went down back in 2016, we were both on the grounds, and we are seeing that no matter what happened in the federal level, that does not affect the sentiment on the ground back in Sarawak. Although at that time, 2016 was quite a brouhaha with the 1MDB case being unveiled by the Department of Justice in the US, but that does not affect with Adnan Satem again. However, current situation without Adnan Satem, there you have Abang Johari, who is the president of PBB. And the current combination of how PBB is within GPS, with the four parties. Right now, the different situation is you have PSB, led by Wong Sung Ko, a breakaway party from SUPP. And what's interesting right now with both Barubian and Sichi Hao joining PSB. While some analysts are saying that PSB will not be a threat to GPS in the upcoming state election. So, do you think that Pakatan Harapan will look into a collaboration with PSB led by Wong Sung Ko in the upcoming state election against GPS? And that's one. Number two, what about Abang Johari? We do know that Abang Johari will be challenged by some of his contenders for his posts. People like Fadila Yusuf is also seen as the next chief minister, or even Awang Tengah. So within PBB itself, it's also very interesting. We see leaders coming up to be the next chief minister. So what do you say about that?
So I'll answer your second question first in terms of the dynamics inside PBB. I do not foresee any challenge towards Abanjo's position as the head of PBB or Chief Minister of Sarawak. If there's going to be any challenge, the challenge will come if GPS does very badly in the state elections. That's when the knives come out and people get replaced. But if Abanjo wins the next state election, it's very obvious speaking to people that it's not possible for him to get the sort of majority that Adinan is getting. But as long as he holds a good majority, it's very unlikely that he'll be replaced or other people can come out. Now, going back to your first question about PSB, this one is an interesting question. The problem is not so much that the opposition will come together to some sort of agreement. The problem with Sarawak for state election is that traditionally the opposition personalities involved have problems working together. This is especially difficult for Wong Sun Ko and the DAP because of the strong personality clashes between the leader of DAP and Wong Sun Ko in the Dewan Undangan Negeri. Those of you who watched the Dewan Undangan Negeri can see that when Wong Sun Ko was part of the GPS administration, there were some really personal issues between him and the leader of the DAP Sarawak. And I think it's very difficult for them to come to some sort of agreement. That's one thing. Now, even if they were to come to agreement on the seat issue, as in a one-to-one fight with GPS, the other problem in Sarawak is that you get lots of fake independents. And the problem with Sarawak is that every time you get 3 or 4 candidates fighting for the same seat, automatically this gives a huge advantage to the ruling party. It used to be Sarawak BN, now it's called GPS. So I expect if there's going to be some sort of agreement among the opposition party, you will see the rise of fake independence. The other big problem you face with GAP is the issue of credibility. Because I think a lot of people in Sarawak, taking a step back, a lot of people in Sarawak, especially the Christian community, were absolutely shocked that Barubian left PKR and joined with Asmin Ali and jumped across to Bersatu and joined this Malay-centric government. Of course, you can argue that Barubian jumped back and now he's with PSB, but there was also a question of credibility. And also, PSB's machinery are not in areas where Barubiang and Sichihao are strong at. Their machinery is strong only in certain areas. So basically, the bottom line is that PSB is not in a position to win government on its own. It may win probably a few seats, but it is those few seats that are crucial in terms of the makeup of how big the opposition will be. My take is that if the elections will be held very soon, let's say third quarter of this year, it is very likely that GPS will win with a huge majority, and that PSB will probably at most pick out 3 to 4 seats. I do not think, realistically speaking, that PSB would do well, as in people in Sarawak talking about winning up to a dozen seats. I don't think that is possible in the current climate. So the bottom line for PSB is that it is a new party. It's creating a lot of waves because they've been holding a lot of events, but their support is confined to a few core areas. And if they try to overstretch themselves, I think it will be problematic. Because I think they'll be stepping on the toes of other parties like DAP and PKR if they want to break out their own core areas. The other big problem, as I mentioned earlier, is the personality clashes between the leaders. So I think seat negotiations will be extremely difficult. And that's probably the reasons why, even as we speak today, they haven't even started discussing the seat distribution issue, even though we know that the Sarawak election is coming very, very soon.
As for the seat discussion, right, we've seen back in 2016 problems within both sides. Back then it was Barisan Nasional Sarawak together with Pakatan Harapan. Pakatan Harapan then, at that time, had overlapping 6 seats, where all 6 of these seats they lost. And for Barisan Nasional Sarawak at that time, they too had a different type of strategy, and they used BN direct candidates, of which later they were absorbed into PBB, and PBB became a single largest party with 44 aduns from PBB at that time. So we are also seeing the slight friction from within GPS itself. We're also seeing some signs that Jones Masing wasn't happy being sidelined. Tiong King Sing of his PDP. Because James Passing at that time he boasted, and of course he delivered 100% of his during the state election, as well as SUPP. How will the other three component parties within GPS are going to negotiate together with PBB? Are they going to stay as it is, status quo, or are they going to negotiate with PBB for a fairer share of seats?
I think you work on the assumption that PBB has always been dominant in Sarawak politics. For many years, they they came up with this narrative that even though they're dominant, they never control more than half the seats within Sarawak Barisan Nasional, usually one or two seats less than half. But as you mentioned, because of the defections, they became more than half. But I can tell you, even at the time when they're supposedly supposed to be less than half of the seats, we know that there were certain aduns in the other party who were basically PBB members, but because of the way the seats were distributed, they were forced to stand under the other three component parties. So PBB always had a monopoly of majority of the seats in Sarawak Barisan Nasional, and they have the same thing in GPS now. I don't think the seat distribution issue or tensions is quite serious in GPS, in the sense that because of the way GPS works, PBB will get the lion's share. We also saw that when they created new seats in Sarawak, even though there was a lot of unhappiness, PBB still ended up with the majority of seats, and they will manage to push the proposals through. So I don't think the seat distribution will be a serious problem in GPS. I also think that this time they will be more careful. They will not use the direct BN candidate system anymore. So, in other words, I don't expect them to use direct GPS candidates. People keep forgetting that this direct BN candidate thing was actually not discussed during the seat negotiation issue in Sarawak BN. Back then, it was a last minute decision because they could not decide at the last minute, and there was some, how should I put it, last minute lobbying by certain tycoons for the Chinese community who could not get a seat under the SUPP quota, so they needed to push their way through and became direct BM candidates. So that was a unique situation, and I don't expect that to be repeated this time. As I mentioned earlier, I think seat distribution GPS is not a problem. The only problem is the Chinese area. What will the Chinese do? Because there are two schools of thought currently in Sarawak about the voting patterns of the Chinese. The first school of thought is that the Chinese are very angry with DAP, especially the performance of the DAP leader when he was deputy minister in the federal government, and that DAP will likely suffer a swing against them in this coming state election. The second view is the view that I've been promoting for the last few months, and that is that ever since DAP lost power at the federal level, now they're back being the opposition. The views of the Sarawak Chinese community has actually changed. Now they actually look towards DAP with a nicer view of the DAP. They can understand that the fall of government means that it's a fully Malay-centric government, and they worry that the Chinese representation. So it's very likely that they may swing back to the DAP this time around. So really, when you talk about Sarawak, bottom line is I don't think there's a lot of problem in GPS. I think the problem is the opposition, because if you look at the opposition closely, GPS is one block. Within Pakatan itself, they actually split into two big blocks. DAP is also trying to expand into the Bumiputera areas, and that immediately put them on the direct clash with PKR. PKR is also in expansion mode under this new leader, Larry Singh, and Larry also carries in him some baggage as well. But what is really interesting, and this is something that's not been picked up by a lot of commentators, is that you have a situation now that two of the most prominent leaders in the Sarawak opposition, which is Larry Singh and Wong Sum Ko. They're both former senior politicians. In fact, they both served as ministers and assistant ministers in the previous BN government. So it's quite interesting that former BN people are now leading the opposition towards GPS in Sarawak. Which is, like, some people say it's karma, but I think there's a sense of irony in it as well.
It's also interesting how things may actually change in the next few months. Um, with how DAP is going to work with PKR. And we do know that PKR actually laid quite a good foundation, especially towards the rural areas. And with Barobia and Sichihao moving out, a total implosion within PKR, that has serious. Do you think that has a very serious effect towards PKR Sarawak?
Yes. If you follow the PKR Sarawak closely, you see that in the last 2 or 3, there's been mass resignation, especially in Kuching and Sichihao followers and Barubian's faction. There's been mass resignations. Uh, you have to remember that basically PKR doesn't have a very strong missionary in the first place. Now with this mass resignation, the missionary will actually get even weaker. Uh, so basically, PKR is in the phase of what we call rebuilding phase, but that takes time, and unfortunately, they don't have time. DAP has a better machinery, but the problem is that DAP's foray into the Mumbutra area has not been successful in the last 3 state elections. And they pour massive resources. In fact, in the last election, 2016 election, they even had MPs from DAP MPs from Peninsula Malaysia, Malaya, who are adopting individual constituencies in Sarawak, sending over a lot of resources, especially in the Bidayu areas, and it did not pan out very well. So basically, I think the bottom line is that it'll be a very difficult thing for the opposition. In terms of the opposition, the strongest party with the best machinery is still the DAP, probably followed by Larison's PKR in certain areas, followed by PSB. So I think for the opposition, I think seat distribution will be a major problem, and I cannot see their leaders working together. They might work together for the sake of the elections, but I think at a personal level, I think it's very difficult for them to work together.
I think we totally forgot about one more component party within Pakatan Harapan, which is Amanah in Sarawak. Again, it is really unfortunate, but the reality is real. Amanah in Sarawak is nearly negligible, unable to penetrate despite many years. Not too many years, but until today, we have not seen a strong presence of Amanah. And they are still seen as just another party, just like PAS within Sarawak. But to what you have mentioned earlier, with DAP trying to venture into Dayak areas, the Ibans, the Bidayus, well, we saw that DAP managed to get Mas Gading among one of them, the Bidayu areas, as Modi Bimo as one of the MP. But do you see that will be reflecting in the upcoming state election for DAP?
No, because as I mentioned earlier, the issues at the federal election and the issues at the state level are very different. It is true that they won at Mas Gading, but again, that was due to some very specific factors, including it's an open secret. There was internal sabotage on the BN side. so I'm not sure you can argue that that shows real support for the DAP. I think my personal take is that the younger Bidayu community are ready to swing. The question is that can the opposition, DAP or whoever it is, can they put out a credible candidate to capture the swing? Because at the local level, the credibility of the candidate is very important. Uh, in almost all the opposition victories in Sarawak at the state election level, right, the opposition personality or the credibility of the opposition candidate is one of the key factors. You cannot run away from it.
All right, I think we actually covered quite a lot, quite extensively on Sarawak politics as well as the upcoming Sarawak state election. Just a quick, I wanted to pick a brain out of you with the current situation in Sabah, where we saw two of APCO's aduns moving out. And who's camping in Sabah right now is Hamzah Zainuddin, the disputed Secretary General of Bersatu. So currently, what we know, the makeup of the aduns in Sabah, Warisan currently holds 33. That is more than half. So with that, do you think there is a possible change of state government in Sabah, despite Warisan holding much of the seats? And will there be a possible, again, maybe some from Warisan will be jumping ship over?
Okay, the way it works in Sabah is that Sabah is very different from Sarawak in the sense that the voters in Sabah are not afraid of a drastic change. So if you look at Sabah's political history for the first 30 years, every 10 years, in fact, they voted to get rid of the state government and change a new government completely. So they're not worried too much about change of government. The second big difference between Sabah and Sarawak is that in Sabah, the katak culture is really well established. Katak here means jumping from party to party. So it's really not a problem for individual aduns to jump in and out of ruling coalition. I think Warisan is quite solid at the present moment. But having said that, it is possible that a big block can jump. But my understanding is that this will depend on what happens at the federal level. So what is interesting about the change in Sabah this time is that it will not be decided by internal Sabah dynamics. It will be decided by what happens in KL. As you mentioned, if all the things happening in Bersatu in KL and UMNO in KL will have a direct impact on what happens among Sabah politicians. My take is that if PN becomes much stronger and stabilize, say from July onwards, for example, if they register as a legal entity like Barisan Nasional, and they can get enough MPs to say around 120, and they can stabilize the government, then there was every chance that they will create a big tsunami in Sabah where more than 10 or 15 aduns can jump across. So it is highly possible, but the unique thing this time around is that it will be decided in Kuala Lumpur, not so much among the Sabahans themselves.
With this in mind as well, and also Pakatan Harapan together with Perikatan Nasional, both are trying to entice Warisan. Of course, Shafi Abdal stated that he gave his support to Mahathir and Pakatan Harapan. But what if in a situation if Pakatan Harapan uses, I won't say use, Pakatan Harapan decides to have Shafi Abdal as the main key person to be as a PM or DPM for Pakatan Harapan Plus. Will that be affecting the dynamics in Sabah, possibly avoiding the mass exodus that may change the state government in Sabah?
I think it is time for the Malaysian Federation to have East Malaysian, either from Sabah and Sarawak, to be the number two political person in Malaysia after the prime ministership. I think going for number one, I don't think it's possible. I think there's enough political talent in Sabah. So, for example, Shafi, I think, has the political skills to be the prime minister. But unfortunately, the Malays in Malaya would not accept this, and are not at the present moment. So I don't think it's possible to put him out as number one. But I think it is possible for him to put him as number two. Now, if that were to happen, of course, it will be a very positive thing for Sabah Sarawak. But it's not going to change the dynamics among the Katak culture in Sabah. The impact will be on the state of federal state relationship, because as you know, one of the things happening in the last 20 years, especially in the last 10 years, is that people in Sabah and Sarawak are very unhappy about this thing called Malaysia Agreement. They feel that Sabah and Sarawak have been marginalized by Putrajaya. So if you can put somebody from Sabah or Sarawak, in this case from Sabah, as the number two person in Putrajaya, I think this will go a long way in showing that Malaya is serious about treating Sabah and Sarawak properly under the new federal state relationship, rather than just seeing Sabah and Sarawak as sort of a periphery part of Malaysia.
I think that really sums up with what's happening within the federal level. And also, how would that dynamics, political dynamics from the federal level affects the two territories rather than states? I think calling the two states in Sabah and Sarawak as states. It's also very interesting to see Awani posted up using the word the territory Sabah, the territory in Sabah. So thank you very much, Prof. James, for sharing your thoughts on this. And that's it we have for Bicara Minggu Ini. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.